Similarly to the relationship between the average product of labor and the marginal product of labor, we have a similar relationship between marginal and average cost curves, whether it's the average variable cost or average total cost. So as before, if that marginal cost, that extra cost of producing, if you produce one extra unit at a lower cost for that unit than the current average, then the average must be falling. If the last unit you produce was more costly to produce per unit than the current average, well then the average must be increasing and they meet up at the AVC's minimum. Same goes for average total cost. The same relationship happens here. And if we look back to the graph that I had, it's the situation that I have here. The marginal cost is below the average in this situation here. Therefore, it's pulling down the average. That extra unit produced at a cost lower than the current average cost will bring down the average variable cost. Will also bring down the average total cost. However, once the marginal cost, that extra unit, is being produced more costly than the average variable cost or more costly than the average total cost, it's going to start bringing it up. It's this relationship, that is highlighted here, and it's very important to remember that it always crosses at its minimum point. Therefore, if you draw it in a certain way that the lowest point, let's say I were to draw it and it goes down here and then starts going up, this would be wrong because it's impossible. It will always need to cross at its minimum point. So these things I'm highlighting are very useful for you guys when you draw the graphs, because you have to make sure you draw them right. If you don't have it this way, then you've made a mistake. When it comes to the average fixed costs, on the other hand, I have a situation that it's not linked to marginal cost anymore because it's not that increasing cost, and it needs to be forever declining. It needs to be forever falling, because if you think that your fixed cost of a certain amount in this past example was 30, if I keep on increasing output more and more and more and more, once output reaches like 1 million or something, that average fixed cost becomes extremely close to zero. Therefore, average fixed cost just keeps on going down and down and down and down and down. And this is where we would be saying in the business that we're spreading overhead. That overhead, that extra cost, that research and development cost or something else is getting spread on a lot of output. So if you wanted to compete with Apple and the iPhone, well, if you produce a phone that's better than them, it's going to take a lot of very specialized machinery. You might be able to do something better than them, but if you don't have a large customer base, your phones will be selling at a crazy price if you want to break even or make a bit of money, because otherwise you won't be able to cover all those costs. But the more you produce, the more you sell, and millions of output, well, then you have a situation that super expensive technological overhead, production overhead, gets spread out on more units, which makes it harder for a new entrant to compete once we have that situation. We'll discuss that a little bit more, that economies of scale, that size, in Chapter 8. Okay. The last thing I want to highlight is kind of this relationship between cost curves and product curves. So marginal product of labor and average product of labor are very similar to marginal cost and average variable costs, in the sense that when marginal product of labor was increasing, so in the past we had marginal product of labor increasing, it's the same situation that we would have marginal costs decreasing. And the opposite for when it decreases. So if I were to just draw it out a little quickly, I would have potentially, this is my output over input is what we had. So I put them one over the other, but it's we'd have to switch it up a little bit. We'd have to set it up as slightly different because we don't have necessarily the same horizontal axis. But generally, we expect, due to specialization and diminishing marginal product, to have a situation like this for these graphs. And for marginal costs and average variable costs, we expect to have something like this. Due to the first part over here is due to specialization, Same thing as down here. And the latter part over here is due to diminishing marginal product of labor or marginal product of capital, diminishing marginal product. Okay. So we have these two situations. It's really important just to note that as my productivity is increasing for these individuals, it's in my specialization phase, and when it starts falling down, it's this idea that we have diminishing marginal product of labor. Same thing here, as my costs are dropping down, it's because of specialization. My per unit costs are dropping on every unit because these new workers are becoming more productive, less costly to produce. But once it starts going up, it's because these extra workers are not as productive as the last few ones hired, and therefore their cost goes up. The big thing to note here is this is not a situation that we hired the most productive workers first and then we have the least productive workers afterwards, which may be the case as well, an extra thing that may happen in practice. But here it's simply due to the fact that if you imagine that we have a bunch of clones working in a subway, well, the first few clones will do a very productive job once they kind of got a bit of specialization and they're setting themselves up. But the more people you add, it's not necessarily going to increase production that much.